Hello, this is Mark Tooley, editor of Providence, a journal of Christianity and American foreign policy. I'm also president of the Institute on Religion and Democracy. And I am hosting with Mark Levecki our new weekly conversation called Marksism, the good kind of Marxism, spelled with a K and an S, involving Mark Levecki, myself, and our managing editor, Mark Melton, who unfortunately cannot be with us today. So it's only two parts of the three-part trinity. So Mark Levecki, how are you doing in Oxford, England this week?
I am well. Oxford is well. Oxford is blistering hot for Oxford. It's 78 degrees today, I think, but none of the humidity that you're probably suffering. So it's nice, but I was walking with Nigel Bigger in Christchurch Meadow today, which everyone should have the opportunity to do at some point in their life.
Nigel Bigger, the distinguished, world-renowned just war scholar with whom you're working at Oxford.
Absolutely, and who writes at least infrequently for Providence and was there at the founding and all such things. But he described Oxford in this time of year as having the Oxford sniffles. And Oxford, you have to understand, is a lovely place and all of that, but it low-lying, and it's essentially built between two large, sometimes stagnant marshes. And so everything bad that can grow here, in terms of allergens, does grow here, and one just has the perpetual Oxford sniffle. And I'm suffering the Oxford sniffle, as is he.
Well,
and in the age of
condolences.
COVID, it makes people nervous.
Yes, at least you and I are healthy, and as you say, it is muggy here in Northern Virginia, but Marxism proceeds, and although it doesn't relate directly to American foreign policy or America's role in the world, let's at least briefly discuss the George Floyd situation in Minneapolis, the black man killed by an arresting police officer, followed by ongoing riots in Minneapolis. Much conversation, understandably, about it. You, Mark, as a Christian ethicist, how do you judge this situation? There are some people, at least on social media, who are in some ways almost justifying the riots as a merited response to racial injustice and police heavy-handedness. What do you say in terms of racial justice and restoring domestic order in Minneapolis?
Yeah, so I mean, first off, I fail, and it's a shame to even have to start with this, but I fail to see the bright line that can be drawn between police brutality and burning down and rioting in a looting and a Target store. That connection is a little bit difficult for me to make. But backing up for just a second, you know, this should be one of those softball moments in American life where you see something and you think, okay, finally, here's something that we can all probably agree on, and now have a rational, carefully nuanced conversation. I can't even suggest that we have that without laughing, because apparently that's simply not what we do anymore. But without jumping the gun, and so my modest qualifier is, you know, partial videos, even when they look like the worst case scenario, can be misleading. And so we ought to be cautious about our judgments. But that said, this one looks like a slam dunk. I mean, you've got people of course, on the left, but also on the right, coming together and saying that this seems like a clear-cut case of excessive force, police brutality. I have a very good friend on the Minneapolis Police Department. My father lives just south of the cities. And he says, you know, he used to be on the police force. He's retired now. He says this is clear. This is not in their training. This should never have been done. His knee ought not to have been on the neck. It ought to have been on the back. But however you view it, you know, whether on the back, whether on the neck, the man was restrained. He wasn't in the videos we saw putting up any kind of resistance. So once you have him subdued, you know, you cease with the excessive force. everybody seems to agree with this. So you would think, and Minneapolis acted reasonably swiftly. They fired, I think, the 4 officers involved. There is an investigation. I understand that people want them in jail now, and but I think we can let the process take its course. As far as the racial dimensions of it, I have absolutely no idea what's in this cop's heart. If he's just a tyrant, if he is a racist, maybe that stuff can come out. He apparently has a history of complaints against him. I don't know the nature of those complaints. My frustration is you've got an example of something that we ought to be able to have a conversation on, let a process take its course, but instead it becomes another occasion to divide. You've got people burning down. I think I was looking for the number earlier. I was looking in the Minneapolis papers, and I think 170 private businesses in the St. Paul, Minneapolis area have been looted or damaged or burned down. And how burning down 170 businesses helps anybody in that community move forward is beyond me. So you don't get justice out of looting a Target.
Well, of course, racial injustice is an extremely difficult topic for white American Christians who, with the best of intentions, typically respond with white guilt and apologies, but don't go very deeper than that theologically. So I don't have answers to offer. We did co-sponsor at Beeson Divinity School 2 years ago with Dr. Jerry McDermott a conference on race in the American Covenant, whose papers will be published later this year, I believe, by the Acton Institute. Perhaps it will offer some help on this topic, but we need a lot more attention and deep theological resources on the issue of racial injustice and racial reconciliation. Well, moving on to what's happening in Hong Kong, the suppression of their liberties and its seeming absorption into authoritarian, one-party ruled mainland China. Obviously, justified indignation and growing global distress over seemingly and increasingly hegemonic China, the situation between China and India with Chinese troops on Indian soil. Obviously, how China has grossly mishandled the coronavirus pandemic, the growth of Chinese military spending, a growing consensus in the United States, bipartisan, for resistance to China as a growing global power, and we can be thankful for that. But I also want to ask you, Mark, how our patron saint, Reinhold Niebuhr, might respond to this situation. There's so much rhetoric on China now as the new main enemy, and perhaps we're entering a new Cold War with China as we had for 40 years with the Soviet Union. I wonder if some of this rhetoric from Niebuhr's perspective might be going a little bit too far in terms of the complete demonization of China and setting up almost a Manichaean polarity between China and the United States. But what are your profound thoughts?
I don't know if they're profound, but yeah, I not a China expert, and not an expert on how Niebuhr viewed China, although he did have, was kind of looking back, and he did have maybe a surprisingly large amount to say about China. But so the first thought is I do think he might think some of the language is excessive. He fairly clearly saw a difference between Soviet-style communism and what he saw emerging in his age in China. Remember that Niebuhr would have seen, he lived in the golden era. He would have seen the rise of Bolshevism all the way through World War I. He would have seen the Japanese-Chinese wars beginning in the early 1930s, the occupation of China in 1937. He would have seen all this. He would have seen the rise of Chinese nationalism. which he thought made Chinese communism quite different than Soviet-style communism. And he would have thought that China has a lot of legitimate grievances. He would have said, before the West gets sort of too maybe glib about this, we should recognize that China has a case to be made for some of the national humiliations they feel they've suffered at the hands of the Japanese, imperialism, Western colonialism, all these different things. Niebuhr might have said, look, there's some legitimate grievances. We could probably talk about some of those grievances and to some degree placate a proud regime, recognize the Chinese people as having given them, being the heirs to a wonderful culture, these sorts of things. So I think he would have said, know the facts on the ground. They might have legitimate complaints. Their nationalism is of a different kind than anything we would have seen in the Soviet Union. I think he would have talked about facts. Also, he would have said, look, all of that said, he wouldn't have been dovish about China. Because the counter set of facts, I think, would have been potentially alarming to him. He would have said, China has the largest population on Earth. It is the second largest economy, in many ways, the largest economy. He would have said, he would have reminded us they have the second largest military spending in the world. We're number one, they're number two. He would have said they have the largest active duty military force in the world. That's important. They are a nuclear power. That's important. And they are a rising peer competitor. And I think Niebuhr, we're going to get mail on this, I'm sure, but I think Niebuhr would have endorsed the Thucydides trap. He would have said, look, they're rising. Human nature, being what human nature is, and we've put him as our patron saint in part because of his realist anthropology. He would have said, look, however wonderful the Chinese are, whatever appropriate grievances they might have, human beings are human beings, and the Chinese, being human beings, are going to behave like human beings do. They're going to have a tendency toward self-interest, toward a desire to dominate, and those things need to be reckoned with. And if Thucydides is right, when a power begins to rise and challenges the already existing powers, then war is more likely than not. And so he would have certainly wanted us to take all those facts on board as we begin to move toward responses.
I think he would have heartily endorsed continued U.S. military supremacy vis-a-vis China. He would have endorsed America's organizing a global alliance of democracies to resist Chinese hegemony, but at the same time, he would readily acknowledge the need for continued negotiation and collaboration with the Chinese wherever possible. Would you agree with that?
No, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, he would have wanted us to push back on their maritime expansionism. He would have absolutely wanted a coalition, especially of Asian neighbors, to work to stand in unison against China. But also, as you say, dialogue and just because of the Thucydides trap is likely, it doesn't mean it is predetermined. And there's a lot that could be done to hopefully prevent war. So,
well, related to this topic of resisting Chinese global hegemony, Mark Amstutz, our friend and contributing editor, longtime professor of international relations at Wheaton University, wrote for Providence this past week a set of principles for Christians on global statecraft, especially in the wake of the coronavirus epidemic, pointing out that the chief goal of statecraft should be the defense of human dignity and pursuing the common good and upholding order. And with those principles in mind, he makes the case that the pandemic has illustrated once again the centrality and the importance of nation states and their sovereignty as being the best instruments for pursuing the common good for respective populations. But at the same time, the pandemic also illustrates the need for international collaboration. So Mark Amstutz is arguing for both a form of, I would call it civic nationalism, but also a form of international cooperation against the extremes of ultranationalism and against the some forms of what's called globalism. I assume you would largely agree with this other Mark Amstutz, Mark Levesque.
Absolutely. Even though I think he misspells his first name, yeah, I think that's right. He's an M-A-R-K, I believe, right? So
yes, the correct way.
Yeah, I know. My name, my grandfather always pointed out, spells something backwards. Nothing particularly wonderful, but there it is. It's something I can hold on to. Yeah, I think that's the balance, right? I mean, Gene Elshtain was always big on pointing out that, before you can belong anywhere, you have to belong somewhere, and national identity matters. And she would have scoffed at the idea that that people can't be proud of where they're from. For some people in certain times, that's easier than for others at other times. But it's right to have patriotic loyalties and fidelities, even as we recognize that the international order doesn't have to be a zero-sum game, where if those guys out there get something, we lose something back home. So she certainly would have seen and always proclaimed the need for a kind of community of nations. We've called it, I think, in our declaration on American foreign policy, that the world is a garden that has to be cultivated, and that there's altruistic reasons for doing that, but there's also self-interested reasons for doing that. If the world is secure, then America is secure. The international order being sort of an outer perimeter of American defense. All those things are important. The one qualifier, and Amstutz would agree with this, but just in the description of his article, the one qualifier, of course, would have to be that sovereignty isn't in and of itself the essential good. Sovereignty, somebody could be sovereign simply because they have a set of borders around them. But the Christian realist would stress that sovereignty isn't just a territorial holding. Sovereignty is a responsibility. And so, yes, sovereignty is crucial, but nation states have to behave. And when you have the Chinese perhaps intentionally mishandling, the pandemic, that's a throwback to old Soviet style denials of, Chernobyl. They would deny their own missteps and misbehaviors. I think, again, going back to China, Rhino Niebuhr would have seen them as an authoritative and ruthlessly authoritative state, in which they demand the whole man and don't want to share the whole man with anything, not a god, not a competing ideology, not dissent, anything like that. So sovereignty has responsibilities. As long as nations are meeting those responsibilities, then they have a right to be sovereign. But yeah, I think Amstutz strikes the right tone. There's a balance between nationalism and a kind of acknowledgement of the importance of the global order that I think Christian realists can stand behind.
So nuance over dogmatism in terms of how Christians should look at global statecraft and cultivating the garden of the public good, I suppose, is an appropriate and positive note on which to conclude this episode of Marksism. Mark Levesque, thank you for your always brilliant contributions, and look forward to speaking with you next week.
Hopefully we're all here, all three Marks. That would be exciting.
Maybe we can draw in Mark Amstutz as well for a quadrilateral.
We absolutely should.
All right, take care, Mark. Bye.
Take care.